Tonight, we drift back to a coastline that feels both familiar and far away, where the Atlantic breathes steadily against wooden piers and lantern light pools on cobblestones like warm honey. The cities are smaller than the ones you know, but they are busy in a quiet way, with sails creaking in the harbor and the soft scratch of quills inside rooms where people stay awake longer than they planned. Imagine Philadelphia after sunset, the air holding a gentle heat, and the Delaware River carrying the last murmurs of the day downstream. Windows are open, curtains flutter, and somewhere a printer's press thumps patiently page after page, as if the machine itself has learned the rhythm of persuasion. In taverns and parlors, in meeting houses and borrowed offices, conversations continue, not loud, not theatrical, but persistent. They return to the same questions the way waves return to shore, wearing down certainty and polishing thought. If you listen closely, you can hear paper being unfolded, then refolded, a letter read twice because its meaning matters. Men arrive from different colonies with different temperaments, and they bring the weather of their regions with them, as surely as they bring their boots and their ink. John Adams carries the sharp air of New England, earnest, tireless, sometimes impatient with delay. He speaks as though time is a narrowing doorway, and independence is something you must step through before it closes. Thomas Jefferson arrives with a quieter presence, thoughtful and private, as if he is always half a room away, already shaping sentences in his mind. You can picture him pausing over a word, testing its balance, knowing that a single line might outlive the hand that writes it. Benjamin Franklin moves through the city like someone who has lived many lives already, calm enough to smile at tension and curious enough to treat every argument as an experiment. He is older now, but he still carries wonder, the feeling that light can be coaxed from darkness if you arrange things carefully. James Madison, still young, watches more than he declares, collecting details the way a careful gardener gathers seeds. He notices how one small phrase can tilt a whole idea, how rules are not chains, but supports that keep a structure standing. And far away in Virginia, George Washington stands in his own long silence, feeling the weight of a country that does not yet know its name. Duty settles on him gently but firmly, like a cloak placed on the shoulders, and he begins to sense that leadership is often restraint, a willingness to hold steady when others rush. Nothing is settled yet, and that is part of the quiet beauty of this moment. The founding in truth begins not with fireworks, but with listening, drafting, revising, and starting again. So let the world slow, and let these early hours gather around you like a shelter. Tonight is not about cannons, but about candlelit rooms, where ideas are handled with care, like glass. Tonight, the city stays awake a little longer, as if the cobblestones themselves sense that something is leaning toward change. Philadelphia's air is warm and faintly smoky, and the Delaware River carries the day's last sounds downstream, smoothing them into quiet. In a modest hall, men gather with papers stacked like small bricks, building a shared argument one page at a time. They call it a Congress, but it feels more like a stitched-together family meeting with cousins who don't fully trust one another yet. Some have arrived after days on the road, coats powdered with dust, pockets full of letters from home, each letter a small instruction and a small worry. Behind the speeches sit recent grievances, new taxes, stricter enforcement, ports constrained, and the feeling that distant decisions are pressing too hard on local life. John Adams leans forward whenever the room drifts into caution, insisting that delay is its own decision, and that principle must be practiced before it is admired. He speaks with the clipped urgency of New England, where meetings are efficient and winter is a teacher. Samuel Adams works the edges of the room, attentive to symbols and public mood, understanding that crowds move when stories move, and that stories need stewards. Across the table, delegates from other colonies measure their words, anxious about trade, about retaliation, about families who will pay the price of boldness. George Washington listens more than he speaks, a tall figure learning to carry a cause without letting it become personal, knowing how easily pride turns into conflict. Benjamin Franklin softens sharp corners with humor, then sharpens soft corners with logic, a rare talent in a tense room, as if he is adjusting the temperature so thinking can happen. Thomas Jefferson, newly arrived, watches the argument like someone studying light through glass, already turning spoken points into phrases he might later refine in solitude. And James Madison, quiet and precise, notices how rules and procedures can turn heat into progress, like channels guiding a river. Outside, printers set type by hand, line after line, and the thump of the press becomes a heartbeat for the cause. Copies travel from shop to shop, then out along roads and rivers, so that an argument made in one room can be heard in 100 others. Inside, they draft petitions, agree on boycotts, form committees, and discover the strange power of coordination. 13 places learning to move as one body. It is not glamorous work, mostly lists and votes and careful minutes, yet it begins to feel like a new muscle learning to move. When the meetings end, they step into the dark streets and hear their own footsteps, each one returning to a rented room with the same quiet question. If we cannot live under old authority, then what exactly will hold us together? And how do you make that together real? The next year, the questions sharpen, as if the air itself has been tightened by unseen hands. News arrives that shots have been fired in Massachusetts, and suddenly debate is no longer only about rights, but about consequence. In Philadelphia again, in rooms warmed by bodies and candle flame, the Second Continental Congress gathers, and the tone is quieter in an urgent way. They still write, still vote, still argue over commas, but now they must also improvise the functions of a national government before one fully exists. Committees multiply like branches on a tree. Committees for finance, for correspondence, for supplies, each one an attempt to make improvisation feel orderly. They authorize supplies, appoint officers, send instructions to provincial assemblies, and search for money that is not yet a currency anyone fully trusts. Paper notes begin to circulate. Continental bills, light as leaves, yet ask to carry the weight of war. John Adams insists that a unified command is necessary, and his gaze keeps returning to a man whose calm seems built for storms. George Washington is chosen to lead the Continental Army, a decision that is both practical and symbolic, binding regions together through a single figure. Washington accepts with careful humility, speaking of his own limits, as if he knows that confidence must be rationed. He leaves the city and rides north, toward camps that smell of smoke and damp canvas, toward soldiers who are brave but uneven, toward a future made of uncertain mornings. Back in Congress, they still try for peace, sending the olive branch petition, a final appeal that sounds respectful even as it admits distance. Benjamin Franklin, newly returned from London, watches the last threads of reconciliation fray and understands that a new kind of relationship is being born in the tearing. Thomas Jefferson keeps mostly to the edges, observing the temperature of the room, learning how arguments sound when they must become policy. A young Alexander Hamilton, far from being a household name, is already writing and drilling, drawn toward the effort by talent and urgency. And James Madison, still more observer than actor, stores away the lesson that urgency needs structure, or it turns into noise. Outside, pamphlets and broadsides begin to harden the public mood, teaching ordinary readers to imagine a separation that once felt unthinkable. Inside, the word independence appears more often, first as a whisper, then as a draft. At night, the founders return to their lodgings and write letters home, the kind that try to sound confident while hiding fatigue. Their handwriting is steady, but beneath the ink you can sense the tremor of risk. The work now is not only to resist authority, but to create legitimacy, to persuade people that this struggle is more than anger. In the hush, notice what has changed. The founders are no longer imagining a future. They are starting to carry it. By early summer of 1776, the city's days feel stretched, as if sunlight itself is waiting for a decision. Inside the familiar hall, the delegates circle the same question until it becomes impossible to ignore. If the colonies are already acting like a nation, then words must catch up with reality. A committee is formed to draft a declaration, and Thomas Jefferson is chosen to write the first version, partly for his clarity, partly because his quiet confidence does not provoke. He returns to a rented room and works at a small desk, the night air moving softly through the window and the faint city sounds rising and fading like breath. You can imagine him pausing over each phrase, hearing it aloud in his mind, seeking language that is simple enough to travel and strong enough to endure. He draws on familiar currents, Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and consent, colonial arguments about representation, then makes them sound like something anyone might recognize as fair. John Adams visits and pushes for boldness, impatient with half measures, as if he can feel history tapping its foot. Benjamin Franklin reads with the calm eye of a printer and a scientist, trimming excess, nudging sentences toward balance, letting the strongest words keep their place. The draft comes back to Congress and is discussed line by line, in a process that is less like inspiration and more like carpentry. Voices rise, then settle, then rise again, as clauses are weighed like stones in the hand. Some passages are revised or removed to keep unity among colonies, proof that even ideals must sometimes negotiate with the fragile need to stay together. And still, the heart remains. The claim that legitimate government rests on consent, and that rights are not gifts from a ruler. On July 4th, the text is adopted, and over the following weeks, signatures are added, ink meeting parchment in a slow procession of names. Outside, printers set the Declaration in type, and copies spread outward, pinned to doors, carried in saddlebags, read aloud in town squares. In those readings, the words become communal, leaving the room of lawmakers and entering the mouths of ordinary people. Some listeners feel exhilaration, others feel fear. Many feel both at once because the statement is a door that swings only one way. Jefferson's sentences, Adams's insistence, Franklin's edits, separate temperaments braided into a single declaration addressed to the world. Tonight, notice the quiet courage of the act. To put a new identity on paper before you have any guarantee you can defend it. The city grows dark again. Lanterns flicker, and the founders return to their rooms with the same thought. A signature is small, but it is heavy, and the night can feel the weight of it for years to come. After the Declaration, the founders learn that words are only the first half of birth. The second half is endurance, the long act of staying. George Washington stands among tents and smoke, facing the unglamorous truth that an army is a hungry, tired community before it is a weapon. He watches recruits arrive with mismatched boots, hears the coughs that spread through damp camps, studies maps by candlelight until the wax pools. He writes letters asking for powder, for blankets, for food, for time, and he learns how quickly confidence evaporates when supplies run thin. His greatest talent is steadiness, the ability to keep moving when applause is absent. When setbacks come, he absorbs them without theatrics, as if his pride is set aside for the sake of the cause. At times, the army retreats, slipping away from stronger forces, carrying its hope like a fragile ember that must not go out. Congress itself moves, worried about capture, and the founders feel what it means to build a nation while walking. Alexander Hamilton, sharp-eyed and quick with numbers, becomes one of Washington's aides, learning that victory often depends on logistics and trust. He drafts orders, calculates supplies, argues for discipline, and begins to think about credit as a kind of national spine. In the late days of 1776, when the air bites and spirits sag, Washington chooses motion over surrender. In darkness, boats push into a cold river, oars muffled, men hunched against wind, the world narrowed to water and breath. We don't linger on violence tonight. We linger on the decision to move, the refusal to let the story end in exhaustion. Back in political rooms, John Adams urges foreign support, convinced that independence must be recognized beyond the coastline. Benjamin Franklin prepares to cross the ocean again, carrying not just requests, but an image of a people attempting self-rule. Thomas Jefferson steps away from the center for a time, returning to Virginia, where his mind continues to orbit the meaning of rights and governance. And Madison continues to watch, reading, writing, learning how fragile a union can be when pressure rises. The war tonight is not a parade of battles. It is weeks of waiting, then sudden motion, then more waiting, seasons turning like pages. It is the sound of boots in mud, the small comfort of shared bread, the discipline of standing a little longer than fear would like. In this slow rhythm, Washington becomes less a general and more a keeper of morale, the person who helps an idea survive its hardest nights. And when evening settles over camp and the fires grow low, you can imagine him looking into the dark and thinking not of triumph, but of continuity. Just keep the line unbroken. Just keep tomorrow possible for everyone. Winter arrives like a long pause, and the revolution has to learn how to breathe in cold air. At Valley Forge, the name itself sounds like iron and patience. The camp is a scattered geometry of huts and tents, smoke rising in thin lines, the ground hard beneath tired feet. Men cut timber and raise rough cabins, not for comfort, but for a chance at sleep that doesn't shake with every gust. Washington walks through it quietly, not as a distant figure, but as someone who must look into faces and keep them from breaking. He has no magic, only persistence. He listens to officers argue, to men complain, to the small illnesses that become big ones when warmth is scarce. He reads reports late into the night, eyes stinging from smoke, then writes to Congress again and again asking for provisions, reminding them that an army cannot be willed into existence by speeches alone. He also learns that morale is a resource like powder or bread, and it must be managed with care. Sometimes morale is a promise kept, a paycheck delivered, a pair of shoes found. Sometimes it is simply being seen by the person in charge, a nod in passing that says, "I know you are here." And still, routines form, because routines are how humans survive uncertainty. Baron von Steuben arrives with discipline and a practical eye, teaching soldiers to move together, to load and drill until the motions become calm. Training turns chaos into habit, and habit turns fear into something manageable. The young Marquis de Lafayette, earnest and loyal, adds energy and companionship. the kind that helps a cause feel less lonely. Hamilton keeps working at Washington's side, impatient with inefficiency, learning how politics and war pull on the same rope. In the evenings, men share what they have, trading stories for warmth, singing softly, mending clothing by firelight. Women in camp cook, wash, nurse, and keep small domestic worlds alive at the edge of hardship, their work rarely celebrated, yet quietly essential. Outside the camp, the world continues. Farms, shops, families waiting, printers setting type, local committees trying to keep order. The founders often speak of liberty, but liberty here has a smell: wood smoke, damp wool, and the thin broth of endurance. When spring finally loosens the ground, the Army is not simply alive, it is more coherent, more capable of holding a line. And Washington, still reserved, still careful, has become something the country can lean on. Not because he promises ease, but because he refuses to abandon the work. Tonight, let the winter feel gentle in your mind, not harsh. Hear the snow hush the camp at night. Hear the slow scratch of a letter being written home. Let it be a long lesson in patience and in how a nation learns to stand by, learning to stand together. While Washington keeps the cause alive on land, Benjamin Franklin carries it across the ocean. The voyage to France is long and rocking, days of gray water and salt wind, nights where the sky feels endless. Franklin arrives older now, moving a little more slowly, yet thinking as brightly as ever. He comes with papers in his trunk, congressional instructions, letters of introduction, and the newest American claim, still fresh in ink. He understands that diplomacy is not only argument, it is atmosphere, patience, introductions, dinners where you listen more than you speak, and letters written in a tone that invites respect. In salons lit by chandeliers, he becomes a gentle curiosity, a symbol of American plainness and possibility. People admire his experiments and his wit, and he quietly lets admiration become leverage, as if social warmth could be turned into political light. Yet behind the charm is steady work, meetings, drafts, requests for loans, requests for supplies, requests for recognition. He explains that the colonies are not rebelling for noise, but building a republic, and that the project is serious enough to deserve investment. In 1778, agreements take shape, treaties that recognize the United States and bind France to the American cause. French support grows gradually, like a candle catching after several tries, until it burns with steadier confidence. Adams, intense and direct, also serves abroad, sometimes struggling with the softer rhythms of court life, but refusing to let effort fade. He presses for loans and recognition in other capitals, convinced that a young nation must prove it can keep its promises. John Jay and others watch for traps inside promises, learning that nations, like people, offer friendship with conditions. Back home, news travels slowly, but when word of alliance arrives, it feels like a new door opening in a house that was running out of rooms. Ships money, and military aid can turn endurance into momentum. Franklin writes to Congress with careful optimism, never overselling, always balancing hope with realism. He knows that enthusiasm can lift a cause, but only reliability can sustain it. In quiet moments, he still thinks like a scientist, noticing patterns, measuring human nature, observing how pride and fear shape decisions. He is a founder not because he commands armies or drafts constitutions, but because he connects worlds, turning admiration into assistance. Tonight, imagine Franklin late at a desk in Paris, candle low, ink dark. The city outside already asleep. He signs another letter and seals it. A small circle of wax, a small act of trust. Somewhere between Paris and Philadelphia, the sea carries that trust in darkness, day after day. And across the ocean, a young nation keeps waiting for the reply. With French support now real, the war's long patience begins to gather toward a conclusion. Years have passed, and the founders have aged in public, their faces more familiar, their private doubts more practiced. Washington coordinates with allies, reading the world like a map. Winds, tides, supply lines, the pace of marching feet. In 1781, the effort converges at Yorktown, where land forces and French naval power align in rare harmony. Tonight, we keep the details soft and human. We notice the planning, the timing, the quiet intensity of coordination, and the way exhaustion can sharpen into focus. We notice, too, how many people must cooperate for any victory to exist at all. Soldiers, sailors, messengers, quartermasters, farmers, and families who kept waiting. When the moment finally turns, it feels less like a shout and more like a long exhale. Afterward comes another kind of work, quieter yet, negotiation. In distant rooms, diplomats argue over borders, debts, fishing rights, and the language of recognition. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay helped shape the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, turning struggle into an accepted fact in the eyes of other nations. Franklin's patience, Adams's stubborn clarity, Jay's cautious realism, three temperaments moving the same pen. A new country is not merely declared, it is acknowledged, mapped, and written into the paperwork of the world. Back home, the Articles of Confederation have already been tried as a first framework. A government deliberately kept weak after years of resisting power. It is enough to hold the states together in war, but peace reveals its thin places where money and authority slip through. Soldiers go home with stories and scars, and often with wages still unpaid. Merchants and farmers argue about debts, and the new nation learns that victory can leave a long bill. Washington returns his commission to Congress, stepping away from military power with deliberate simplicity. The act surprises Europe, where generals often become rulers. In America, it becomes a precedent, a quiet instruction. Authority is borrowed, not owned. At Mount Vernon, He walks among trees and fields, and the silence after command is both relief and emptiness. Franklin returns home older still, carrying the weariness of negotiation and the satisfaction of having secured what seemed impossible. Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, each feels the shift from survival to responsibility, because peace does not answer the hardest question. Peace only asks it more clearly. Now that you are free, how will you govern yourselves? Tonight, let that question settle gently, like a blanket placed over a sleeping child. The war is fading, but the founding is not finished. It is only changing shape. Peace arrives, and with it comes the ordinary pressure of running a country on ordinary days. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government is more like a meeting than a machine. Congress can request funds, but it cannot reliably collect them. It can propose policies, but it cannot easily enforce them. The founders had feared a distant authority that might feel like the crown, so they built something deliberately light. Yet, lightness has its own risk. Money is scarce, debts linger, and each state makes its own choices about trade and taxes, sometimes bumping against neighbors like carts on a narrow road. Some states print their own paper notes. Some impose tariffs on goods crossing borders that used to feel internal. Merchants complain that commerce has become a puzzle of conflicting rules. There is no strong national court system to settle every dispute, and no dependable executive to carry decisions into practice. Alexander Hamilton looks at this and feels impatience in his bones. He believes that credit is not just finance, but reputation, and reputation is a kind of survival. Without a stable system, he worries the republic will look temporary to the world and unreliable to itself. James Madison sees another danger, that a loose union could become a collection of rival interests, unable to act together when action matters. He reads about past confederacies late at night, studying failures like cautionary tales, and returns again and again to the same thought. Liberty needs design. Even Washington, longing for quiet at Mount Vernon, watches the situation with concern, writing carefully about unity as if unity were a fragile tool that could be dropped. Benjamin Franklin, in his last years, still tries to soften division, reminding people that cooperation is not sentiment, but a practical choice. In Massachusetts, economic hardship and resentment flare into unrest, and leaders notice how quickly order can fray when people feel unheard. Tonight, we don't linger on conflict. We simply notice the signal it sends. A government must be strong enough to respond, yet limited enough to be trusted. So, conversations turn toward revision. In 1786, delegates meet at Annapolis to discuss commerce, but the small turnout becomes its own message. Hamilton and Madison push for something larger, a convention in Philadelphia to repair the framework. Letters go out, invitations written with careful politeness, as if asking the states to try again. this time with more courage. A new question settles over the country, quiet but insistent. Carriages begin to roll again toward Philadelphia, wheels humming over brick and dirt, carrying hopes wrapped in leather satchels. How do you build power that can act without building power that can dominate? Philadelphia in 1787 feels like a familiar stage with a different kind of tension. Delegates arrive from the states, some eager, some wary, all aware that the old framework may not survive the summer. They meet in the State House, and the windows are kept shut for secrecy, turning the room warm and heavy with breath and wool. The air smells of paper, sweat, and sealing wax. Outside, carts rattle over stone, but inside, even footsteps sound careful. George Washington is chosen to preside. He speaks little, but his presence steadies the work because people trust his restraint, and trust is the rarest currency in the room. Benjamin Franklin, now elderly and often in pain, still carries a calm humor that can cool a rising argument. He reminds them gently that no one will get a perfect document because no human mind is perfect. James Madison takes his seat and begins to write. He writes as if the country's memory depends on him, capturing speeches, objections, compromises, and the subtle shifts of opinion. He has studied republics and confederacies, and he comes prepared with a plan for a stronger national government, later known as the Virginia Plan. Representation, he argues, should reflect population, and the national government should have real authority to act. Small states worry about being swallowed. Large states worry about being paralyzed. The debate is immediate, intense, and strangely methodical, as if everyone understands that the structure must be precise or it will fail. Alexander Hamilton, brilliant and impatient, presses for energy in government, convinced that weakness is not liberty, but vulnerability. Others press for limits, convinced that energy can become tyranny if not restrained. They speak about power the way craftsmen speak about weight, where it should rest, how it should be supported, what happens if it tilts. They debate whether one person should lead the executive branch or several, and how long such power should last. Hard questions hover at the edges, too, especially the unresolved injustice of slavery and how it will be treated in a system built on rights. Tonight, we hold that truth softly, noticing that some problems are bargained around rather than solved, pushed forward into the future. Day after day, the founders return to the same tables, the same inkstands, the same heat. They draft motions, vote, reconsider, and vote again, learning that a republic is built by repetition. And outside, Philadelphia's streets carry on, ordinary life moving past a building where the future is being redrawn. Tonight, let the convention feel like quiet craftsmanship, a nation being built not with fireworks, but with drafts, revisions, and the brave discipline of compromise, slowly, stubbornly, in heat and hush. As June deepens, the convention begins to feel like a tide, arguments rising, receding, returning with new force. Quills scratch, ink blots, and water pitchers sweat in the heat, as if the room itself is working. The question of representation refuses to settle. Large states want a voice proportionate to population. Small states fear becoming whispers beneath larger neighbors. The room grows tense, not from anger alone, but from the awareness that without agreement, the union itself could remain a fragile promise. Delegates wipe their brows, shuffle papers, and listen as familiar points are made again in new language, hoping repetition will turn into clarity. Roger Sherman and others from Connecticut offer a bridge. 2 chambers, they propose, one house representing the people by population, another representing the states equally. It is a compromise that does not delight anyone fully, which is often how you know it may work. Madison worries that equal state representation could distort majority rule. Others insist that without it, they cannot go home and claim safety for their state's voices. Washington listens, letting the debate exhaust itself until it is ready for a solution. Franklin suggests that prayers might help, not as theater, but as a way to remind everyone that humility is part of the job. Slowly, the great compromise takes shape, a hinge that lets the door open instead of slamming. Then come other bargains, quieter but heavy. How will the nation count people for representation and taxation when the reality of slavery stands in open contradiction to the language of rights? They reach arrangements that are practical in the moment and morally unfinished, pushing the hardest reckoning into later generations. Tonight, we hold that complexity gently, without denial and without heat, simply noticing how a founding can be both brilliant and incomplete. They debate commerce, too, whether the national government should regulate trade and how to balance northern and southern interests. They debate the length of terms, the power to tax, the authority to raise armies, the meaning of sovereignty. They debate how to choose a president, wary of kings yet wary of weakness, searching for a method that is neither pure popularity nor pure elite selection. Ideas appear, disappear, return with amendments, like birds circling a field before landing. Committees are formed to draft language, to translate arguments into clauses that can hold. Each debate is a seam being stitched, thread pulled tight, then loosened, then tied again. By midsummer, the convention has moved from "should we" to "how exactly." And in that shift, you can feel the founders crossing a threshold. They are no longer merely repairing the articles. They are building something new. In the later weeks, the conversation turns from seats and counts to the deeper engineering of power. The founders speak as if building a clock that must keep time through storms. They agree that liberty is not protected by good intentions alone. It is protected by design. So they divide authority into branches: a legislature to make law, an executive to carry it out, and courts to interpret and apply it. Each branch is given tools, and each is given limits, so that ambition meets ambition, and no single hand can grip everything at once. Hamilton argues for energy in the executive, a leader who can act decisively when action is needed. Others insist on restraint, terms, impeachment, shared powers, and the idea that the president is not above law. They debate the very word executive, as if naming the role too boldly might summon the wrong spirit. How should this leader be chosen? Direct election feels risky to some. Distant selection feels illegitimate to others, so they design a layered method, the Electoral College, as a bridge between the public and the office. The veto is debated, then accepted, then balanced with the possibility of an override. Appointments and treaties are debated, then woven into a shared process, so that the executive must cooperate with the Senate. They give Congress the power to tax, to regulate commerce, to raise armies, to coin money, to make laws needed to carry powers into effect. They reserve other powers to the states, and in that division, you can feel the founders trying to keep government close to people without making it too scattered to function. The judiciary takes shape more quietly, as if the founders sense that courts will grow powerful by habit rather than by drama. Life tenure for judges is discussed as a way to make them less vulnerable to political weather. And still, the founders are cautious. They know that rules on paper must become rules in practice, and practice depends on people. So they also write about the people. They anchor authority in "we the people," a phrase that shifts the source of legitimacy from states alone to the public itself. It is a simple opening that changes everything, like a key turning in a lock. In the warm room, Gouverneur Morris refines language, giving the document a voice that is spare and steady. Madison watches the pieces align, his notes a quiet mirror of the design he once imagined. Washington presides, patient, letting the structure emerge without forcing it. Franklin, nearing the end of his life, keeps reminding them that compromise is not surrender. It is the price of living together. Tonight, feel the moment when the document begins to resemble a living framework. Not perfect, not complete, but capable of holding disagreement without shattering. A container for a complicated human future. As summer begins to soften, the convention turns from argument to language. They form committees to shape the final text, translating days of debate into clauses that can stand on their own. This is a different kind of labor, not the drama of speeches, but the careful work of making sure the doors and hinges fit. Words are tested for meaning. A single "shall" can tighten power. A single "may" can loosen it. Paragraphs are rearranged, redundancies trimmed, and the whole document is read aloud again as if sound can reveal weakness. Gouverneur Morris and others help refine the phrasing, giving the Constitution a voice that is plain enough to last. Madison reviews, adjusts, accepts that the final document is not his private design, but a public creation. Hamilton, though sometimes dissatisfied, understands that a workable framework is better than a beautiful collapse. Washington remains the quiet center, and the room, for the first time in months, begins to feel like it might finish. On September 17th, 1787, signatures gather. Not everyone signs. Some delegates cannot accept the compromises, especially the unresolved bargains over slavery and the fear of concentrated power. But most do, and ink dries on parchment in a solemn hush, the kind that makes even breathing sound loud. Franklin looks at the carved sun on Washington's chair and remarks that he has often wondered whether it was rising or setting. Now he says he believes it is rising. The document is then sent out to the states, carried by horse and ship, wrapped in careful instructions, and the country begins a new phase of founding, persuasion. Supporters argue that the new framework is strong enough to govern and limited enough to trust. Opponents warn that a distant government might again grow deaf to ordinary people. George Mason's refusal to sign echoes through the debate, and Patrick Henry's warnings give voice to a widely shared anxiety. Hamilton takes to his pen with urgency, writing essays to explain and defend the plan. Madison joins him, calm and systematic, translating structure into reason. John Jay adds his own clear logic. Their arguments appear in newspapers, read by candlelight in kitchens and taverns, debated aloud by people who have never met the authors. It is a quiet kind of campaign, made of paragraphs instead of rallies. State by state, ratifying conventions are called, and the debate gains names: Federalists and Anti-Federalists, each claiming to protect the Republic in their own way. Tonight, feel the shift from a sealed room to an open public. Hear the press thump, smell the ink, imagine fingers stained dark from turning pages. The Constitution is no longer a private draft. It is a question offered to millions. Will you trust this design enough to live inside it? The ratification debates move like weather across the states, sometimes calm, sometimes sharp, always present. In meeting halls, people listen as speakers warn and reassure, as if the future were something you could weigh on a scale. The Constitution is read aloud, then argued over, then read again. Supporters point to its checks and balances, its division of powers, its promise of stability. Opponents point to what is missing: an explicit list of rights, plainly written so that limits cannot be forgotten. Newspapers fill with essays and replies, and in the margins of daily life, political philosophy becomes ordinary conversation. Hamilton writes with urgency, Madison with calm precision, Jay with clear steadiness. They explain factions, representation, separation of powers, trying to make design feel intuitive. James Madison, though he helped design the framework, hears the call for rights as practical rather than insulting. He understands that trust needs visible boundaries. And so, even before the new government fully begins, the idea of amendments starts to feel like a bridge. State conventions ratify with conditions and recommendations, asking for protections of speech, religion, due process, and personal security. Virginia debates fiercely, Massachusetts bargains toward acceptance, New York hesitates, then moves, and each decision feels like a stitch pulled through fabric. One by one, states agree. In 1788, with the ninth ratification, the Constitution gains the number it needs to take effect. Still, the work of persuasion continues because legitimacy is not only legal, it is emotional. It lives in whether people feel the system belongs to them. In 1789, the first Congress meets, and Madison turns toward the promise of a Bill of Rights. He gathers proposals, sorts them, refines them, and shapes them into amendments that can be remembered. The language is spare, freedoms of speech and press, protections against unreasonable searches, the right to fair trial, the insistence that powers not granted are reserved. Debate continues even here. What to include, what to omit, how to phrase limits so they protect without paralyzing. In 1791, 10 amendments are ratified, and the Bill of Rights becomes part of the nation's foundation. Franklin, near the end of his life, sees the promise becoming real. Washington prepares to take office as the first president, and the founders sense that their experiment is moving from design to daily life. Post riders carry election news along cold roads, and people gather to hear results read aloud, then drift home under stars. Tonight, let that transition feel gentle now. A door opens. A new house must now be lived in. And living, as they are about to learn, is the truest test of any blueprint. In 1789, the new government begins to move, not with fanfare alone, but with paperwork, oaths, and ordinary procedure. George Washington travels to New York, the temporary capital, through crowds that feel more awed than celebratory. He understands that being first means every gesture becomes instruction. So he chooses simplicity where he can, formality where it steadies the institution, and restraint as a kind of public language. He takes the oath, and the Republic takes a breath with him. Inside the hall, the air smells of wool and wood and ink, and outside, the harbor wind keeps moving, indifferent to history. John Adams stands nearby as vice president, dutiful, intelligent, sometimes restless, a man built for argument, now asked to preside quietly. In Congress, James Madison is there too, turning the idea of amendments into real proposals, shaping the Bill of Rights with the same patient craft he brought to the convention. Washington forms a cabinet, an innovation not written explicitly into the Constitution, but necessary for making it work. Alexander Hamilton becomes Secretary of the Treasury, bringing urgency to numbers and a belief that credit is national character. Thomas Jefferson returns from France as Secretary of State, carrying a love of agrarian independence and a suspicion of concentrated finance. Henry Knox takes war, and Edmund Randolph becomes Attorney General. As the executive branch begins to assemble itself like a new instrument, Congress creates departments, passes tariffs to raise revenue, and begins the first census, measuring the nation as if measurement could make it more real. The judiciary also takes shape. John Jay becomes the first Chief Justice, and early courts begin to translate constitutional theory into daily decisions. Washington watches these institutions form with a careful eye. He knows that the Constitution is not self-acting. It needs habits. So he establishes customs, consulting the Senate, issuing proclamations with measured tone, meeting with advisors, accepting criticism without retaliation. He visits states, listens to local concerns, and tries to make the federal government feel present without feeling oppressive. In quiet ways, he teaches the country how to have an executive without a monarch. Late at night, he sits with stacks of correspondence, learning that a presidency is often listening at a distance, making decisions without applause, then accepting the consequences as your own. Tonight, feel the steadiness of these first steps. A government learning to walk. Soon the capital will move again, and the routines will travel with it, proving they are stronger than any single city. Not perfectly, not without strain, but with a deliberate attention to balance. The founders have built a frame. Now they begin to live inside it. With the machinery now running, the founders face a quieter kind of threat: financial weakness. Alexander Hamilton believes that the republic must become credible, not only in speech, but in payment. He proposes that the federal government assume state debts from the war, turning many obligations into one national promise. He argues that honoring debts will build trust, and trust will lower the cost of borrowing, and borrowing, when disciplined, can help a nation survive shocks. To Jefferson, the plan feels like a tilt toward cities, bankers, and concentrated influence. To Madison, it feels like a risk that a few powerful interests could steer the new government. The debates are fierce, and yet they take place in Congress, in print, in formal rooms, a sign that the system can hold its agreement. Hamilton also proposes a national bank, a place to stabilize money and credit, to help the government manage revenue and payments. Jefferson objects on constitutional grounds, wary of implied powers. Hamilton responds with a broader interpretation of national authority, arguing that the government must be able to carry out its responsibilities effectively. Out of this tension, political factions begin to form. Even though many founders dislike the idea of parties, Madison and Jefferson, once central architects of the system, now become leaders of an organized opposition, insisting that power should remain close to citizens and states. Washington, who longs for unity, finds himself surrounded by competing advice. He listens, weighs, decides. As revenue measures expand, tariffs at ports, and later an excise tax that reaches into rural life, resentment sometimes rises. When protests over the whiskey tax flare in the 1790s, Washington responds with a careful show of federal authority, aiming to enforce law without turning enforcement into revenge. Tonight, we hold that moment gently as a lesson. A government must prove it can act, but it must also prove it can restrain itself. And in one of the most famous moments of quiet negotiation, a bargain is struck. Support for Hamilton's financial program is paired with agreement on a permanent national capital along the Potomac, a place that will become Washington, D.C. The founders are learning that politics is often trade-offs, not because people are shallow, but because the country is plural. Notice how different temperaments shape the same project. Hamilton builds systems. Jefferson protects ideals. Madison designs limits. Washington protects legitimacy. Tonight, notice how the founding shifts from philosophy to administration. Budgets, tariffs, debts, institutions. It can sound dry, but it is the bloodstream of the Republic. And as Hamilton writes reports late into the night, and Jefferson returns home to draft replies, you can feel a new rhythm emerging, not a revolution now. A government arguing with itself and continuing anyway. As the decade turns, the founders begin to feel how time changes a republic. Washington serves a second term, and the weight of being the unifying figure grows heavier. Parties harden, newspapers sharpen their tone. Foreign turmoil, especially the wars in Europe, sends nervous waves across American politics. Washington tries to keep the nation neutral, understanding how easily a young country can be pulled into older storms. He also worries about faction, not because disagreement is evil, but because bitter division can make people forget they share a framework. When he decides not to run for a third term, the decision is almost as important as any law. He is teaching the nation that power can be temporary. His farewell address reads like a calm letter left on the table. Warnings about partisan spirit, reminders about unity, cautious notes on foreign entanglements. Then he returns to Mount Vernon, to fields and familiar routines, and the quiet after public life feels almost unreal. In 1796, another test arrives. A new president is chosen. John Adams, diligent and principled, becomes the second leader of the Republic, and the transition happens peacefully through process. It is easy to overlook how rare that is. Adams inherits tension with France, and the government prepares for possible conflict at sea. He builds defenses, supports a navy, and navigates an uneasy period sometimes called the quasi-war, trying to protect the nation without letting fear take the wheel. In the background, Hamilton cannot fully step away from politics, advising, criticizing, pulling at the threads of influence. Jefferson, as Adams's vice president, stands in an awkward closeness to the administration he opposes. Abigail Adams watches all of it with sharp intelligence, understanding the cost of public service in private hours. Fear, once invited in, can tempt governments to overreach. The Alien and Sedition Acts are passed, and critics warn that speech and dissent are being squeezed. Tonight, we hold this as another lesson rather than a wound. The Bill of Rights is not only an ornament, it is something people must invoke, debate, and defend in real time. Adams, for all his stiffness, chooses restraint when a full war seems possible, preferring negotiation to unnecessary escalation. And the Republic survives the strain, not because everyone agrees, but because the rules still function. Elections are held. Courts operate. Newspapers argue loudly. The lights stay on, still now. The founders, who once fought for a new system, now learn what it feels like to be governed by it. Tonight, let that feeling be quiet and human. A nation growing up, learning that stability is not silence. Stability is the ability to disagree without breaking the house. The election of 1800 arrives like a storm that insists on being weathered. Arguments feel sharper, and the stakes feel personal, as if the young republic is testing whether it can change direction without losing balance. When the outcome becomes clear, the country witnesses something precious. In towns and ports, results are read aloud, and people argue, then go back to work, as if normal life itself is part of the proof. Power transfers peacefully from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. Adams leaves early, wounded and proud, but he does not turn disappointment into crisis. His restraint becomes another hidden beam in the structure. Jefferson's inauguration is notably plain. He walks rather than rides in grand procession, as if to say that the office is large, but the man should remain ordinary. He speaks of unity, of being all one people despite factions, trying to soothe the nation's nerves. In his private life, he is still the Jefferson of books and architecture, a man who thinks in measurements and melodies. He brings James Madison close as Secretary of State, relying on Madison's quiet steadiness to help guide policy. In the background, the judiciary finds its voice. Under Chief Justice John Marshall, the Supreme Court asserts the principle of judicial review, the idea that courts can strike down laws that conflict with the Constitution. In Marbury v. Madison, the decision quietly strengthens the balance of the system, adding another check without firing a shot. Jefferson's presidency, too, is filled with the tension between ideals and necessity. He prefers a limited federal role, yet the Louisiana Purchase offers a vast expansion, and he stretches interpretation to seize what he sees as a national opportunity. He sends explorers west, curious about rivers and plants and maps, letting the Enlightenment spirit take the form of travel. The founders are learning that leadership is often adaptation. Meanwhile, Hamilton's star, once bright in Washington's cabinet, dims under rivalry and fatigue. His death in 1804 ends a life of urgency, leaving behind institutions and arguments that continue without him. Adams and Jefferson, once close collaborators in the cause of independence, grow distant in this partisan age, each believing he is protecting the republic in his own way. Madison remains near the center, a steady mind moving through transitions, watching how the Constitution behaves under stress. Tonight, notice the quiet theme: continuity. The founders disagree, age, step aside, and even disappear, yet the framework keeps holding, not because it is magical, but because people keep choosing procedure over impulse. The country is learning, slowly, how to be itself, and that learning, like the night, takes time, in the end, quietly. As the years roll forward, the founders begin to leave the stage one by one, and the Republic learns to stand without their shadows. Washington is gone by 1799, returning to silence at Mount Vernon and then into memory. Franklin has already passed in 1790, leaving behind a style of leadership that feels like warmth, practical, curious, quietly humane. Hamilton is gone in 1804, his urgency ending abruptly, his institutions continuing without him. And yet the founding continues. James Madison becomes president in 1809, the quiet architect now responsible for the living structure. He faces renewed pressure from Europe's wars and the strain that leads to the War of 1812. Tonight, we hold that conflict softly, noticing less the battles than the lesson. The nation survives stress by relying on institutions it once had to invent. After the war, the government continues, laws passed, courts meeting, elections held, proof that the frame can hold even when the weather turns. Madison returns to private life with a rare perspective. He has designed a system to contain conflict, then watched it contain conflict. At Montpellier, he walks slowly, reads widely, and writes as if still tending the Republic like a garden that needs careful attention. Jefferson grows older at Monticello, surrounded by books, gardens, debts, and a mind still turning ideas over like stones. He helps found the University of Virginia, dreaming of education as the long-term protection of liberty. John Adams lives in Massachusetts with the sturdy habits of a man who never stopped thinking, even when thinking hurt. For years, Adams and Jefferson remain estranged, their friendship fractured by politics. Then, in 1812, they begin to write to one another again. The letters are long and reflective, less like arguments and more like two voices walking side by side at dusk. They revisit old decisions, old hopes, and the meaning of Republican government, and they also circle hard themes, religion, human nature, the limits of virtue, without always finding comfort. Madison reads, advises, and continues to worry gently about faction, about civic habits, about whether citizens will keep choosing patience over heat. In the 1820s, under James Monroe, there is talk of an era of good feelings, a phrase that sounds like a lullaby, even as the country remains complicated. In 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, Adams and Jefferson both die, as if the story is quietly closing a circle. But the documents remain. The Constitution sits like a steady frame. The Bill of Rights rests like a set of guardrails. And the founders, in ink and paper, continue to speak, softly, persistently, to generations they could never imagine. Tonight, let their later years feel tender, not triumphant, not tragic, simply human, a group of tired men who kept writing, kept revising, kept hoping that the morning would hold. Now, gently, we drift to the present, and the founding feels less like a single event and more like a quiet system that keeps running. Imagine Philadelphia after dark, Independence Hall standing quietly while the city around it settles, brick walls holding centuries of echoes. Or imagine a museum room where parchment rests behind glass, lit softly so the ink can endure. People stand without speaking, reading familiar lines as if hearing them for the first time. We, the people, look small on the page, and yet it holds so much weight. Outside, cities hum, courts open and close, ballots are counted, town meetings argue about budgets and sidewalks, juries listen, deliberate, decide, and still, beneath all that motion, the same old framework keeps inviting the same discipline. Disagree, but stay inside the rules. The founders, for all their brilliance, were not marble. They were tired men in hot rooms, men with temperaments that clashed, men who revised drafts and changed their minds, men who carried contradictions they did not resolve. Washington taught restraint by stepping away. Adams taught stubborn principle, even when it cost him comfort. Jefferson taught the power of language, the strange durability of a well-shaped sentence. Franklin taught connection, humor, diplomacy, practical optimism. Madison taught architecture, checks, balances, the patient craft of design. Hamilton taught systems, credit, institutions, the need for a nation to keep its promises, and around them were countless others, known and unknown, whose work made the Republic real in daily life, in clerks' ledgers and printers' hands, and ordinary neighbors learning to disagree. Tonight, you don't have to judge them like statues. You can simply notice what they attempted. They tried to build a way for a diverse people to share a public world without needing a single ruler to force agreement. They tried to turn conflict into procedure, ambition into balance, fear into law. They did not finish the work. No founding ever does. Instead, they left a set of tools, documents, habits, precedents, and the quiet expectation that tomorrow can be handled without breaking today. So as you lie here, let the story soften. Hear the distant scratch of a quill. Hear the slow thump of a printing press. Hear the hush of a sealed letter being carried along a road, the future inside it, folded neatly. Hear the calm footsteps of a man leaving office, returning power to the people, as if that return were the most important act of all. The world slows, and so do we. The lights dim. The arguments fade into the background like waves receding. And in the stillness, you can feel the strange comfort of a system designed for imperfect humans, continuing to hold even now, too. Good night.